Roosevelt's focus was going to be on the economy and not on civil rights. He's successful in terms of his programs. He is successful, but the economic situation in the 1930s, going back to the outline, because of the Depression, if it was hard on whites, it was doubly hard on blacks and other minorities. It was much worse for them, and which is ironic because both blacks and whites and minorities were suffering tragically from the economic circumstances. Minorities were just suffering all that much more. So there were political issues, there were societal issues, and still African Americans were treated as second-class citizens. There was a political revolution, this is point number 2, in 1932. We call it, political science folks call it, a realignment. And it happened with the election of FDR because he went around and campaigned and he said, I will put you back to work. Vote for me and I will put this country back together again. And for the very first time since the election of 1865, African Americans voted overwhelmingly for FDR, overwhelmingly for the Democratic candidate. Prior to that, they had always, when they were allowed to vote, always voted for the Republican Party. Why did they always vote for the Republican Party? Abraham Lincoln. It was the tie to Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln was a Republican, and he freed the slaves. He's the person, that we have to thank for the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment. We will always hold our loyalty to the Republican Party because Lincoln was a Republican. Even though the Republican Party was not doing anything for them, certainly in the 20s or in the 30s, they didn't do anything. Prior to that, not much either. But there was a realignment in 1932, and you have overwhelmingly they vote for the Democratic Party in 1932. Still today, in the most recent election in 2016, overwhelmingly, over 90% of African Americans who voted in the presidential election in 2016 voted for the Democratic Party. So it's still here even from 1932 all the way to 2016. So when FDR, is point number 3, goes around the country and he says, I will put this country back to work, he promises people a new deal. He says, I will have a new deal when I get into office. I will try program after program after program. And, if one doesn't succeed, I'll try another one. I'll use the budget to build big government projects, and I'll put people back to work. I'll build bridges, and I'll build dams, and I'll build hospitals, and I'll build schools, and I'll build roads and everything, and all the people will finally get to go back to work. And it happened. At the end of the New Deal, which is about 1938, almost everybody who wanted a job had a job. It didn't matter if you were white, if you were a minority, it didn't matter. The New Deal didn't create 100% employment, it came very close. It would actually be the Second World War that would come along, and there would be full employment by the time you got to 1941. His record, I would say, on civil rights is somewhat mixed. Blacks are working during the New Deal. They do get those jobs that he promised. Easier in the North and in the South. A lot of New Deal programs were not accepted in the South quite as well as they were in the North. And in terms of executive leadership, again, like I said, he doesn't do anything specific on civil rights. He does have what he calls a cabinet. The press actually called it a black cabinet. And a cabinet, as we know, presidents have cabinets, and they are there to advise. Members of the cabinet today include the Secretary of Defense, the Secretary of Treasury, the Secretary of State, et cetera, all the way down to the Secretary of Agriculture. There was a quote-unquote black cabinet. of black officials that would come to advise him from time to time. They weren't official government representatives, but I would say that it was more than any other president prior to FDR. Again, but it's not official and they don't have any official power. But it is more so than any other president prior to FDR. At the time, in the mid-30s, there was a push for anti-lynching legislation through Congress. He resisted it for political reasons. He would not support it because he didn't want to lose the Democratic support of the Deep South, which is where a lot of Democratic votes were coming from. So he doesn't act on that. He heard it, he gave it a hearing, but he refused to act. It's a step, but it didn't go anywhere, so I would say that it was not very effective. The person, however, who was very close to him, who was effective, is point 8. Eleanor Roosevelt was huge supporter of African American rights. In manner, by words and deeds, she supported African Americans and minorities and their civil rights concerns, absolutely. She could do things that her husband could not do for political reasons. She was photographed regularly with blacks in their homes, with their children, in the workplace. She consistently advocated for African American rights and concerns, and she repeatedly brought them to the attention of FDR, her husband. A good example of this was something that happened in 1939 with a woman by the name of Marian Anderson, who was a world-renowned, internationally renowned opera singer. She was African American. And she was asked to sing at Howard University as part of a fundraiser, and she agreed. Howard is a historically black college. She was very honored to have been asked. The problem was that she was so popular, Tyrell. She's so popular that she sells more tickets than there are seats. So Howard needed to find a new location in which she could actually perform so they could sell as many tickets as possible, hence raising lots of money for Howard. And so Howard University approached the Daughters of the American Revolution. It's a large organization, still in effect today, where you can be a member of the Daughters of the American Revolution if you can prove that your ancestor fought in the Revolutionary War, if you were white. They didn't want anybody who was black in their organization. They had a huge, huge hall that would have worked great. The DAR, Daughters of the American Revolution, they refused because Marian Anderson was black. They refused. They would not have her sing. And Eleanor Roosevelt herself was a member of DAR. She was a member, Tyrell, if you can even believe it. She was a member of the Daughters of the American Revolution. She resigned her membership of the DAR in absolute disdain for their decision that they would not have her sing at their hall. How dare they not do that? She resigned. And she arranged for Marian Anderson to perform not in another hall, but at the steps of the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C. Hence showing her support. I think it's a great irony. It's kind of the irony that we saw when Martin Luther King is at the bottom of the steps of the Lincoln Memorial and giving his I Have a Dream speech, and we have Abraham Lincoln in the background. It's a great optic, and it speaks volumes. So I would say baby steps. baby steps given the last 65 years. I would say that the death of FDR was a loss for African Americans. And it was through Eleanor's leadership and continued leadership. She lives into the 1960s. She continues to fight for the rights of minorities the rest of her life. Following FDR, the next president, number 10, is Harry Truman. Harry Truman was a deft politician, meaning he was a pretty gifted politician who comes from Missouri, the middle of nowhere, Missouri. He was not going to be radical on civil rights. He frequently used the N-word, referring to African Americans. He certainly didn't believe in racial equality or social equality, but he did think that all citizens were equal. He doesn't push civil rights legislation. However, he does issue executive orders. He doesn't go through Congress. Going through Congress takes time. So if you issue an executive order, most of them have to be complied with right away. And for example, probably in terms of our subject matter, the biggest executive order that he issues is to desegregate the military. He issues that executive order to desegregate the military and acts very quickly and very personally on it. The desegging of the military is huge, and we will talk about that more tomorrow when I give that lecture about African Americans and their civil rights in the military. But it's huge. And it became very obvious to Harry Truman, thinking about what had happened in the war. He had fought in the war, and he knew how illogical it was to have a desegregated military. It meant separate training facilities for blacks and whites. It meant separate barracks for blacks and whites. It meant separate everything for blacks and whites, and it made no sense. Economically, it makes no sense. It's ridiculous. Separate mess halls, separate. It was costing a fortune. So even just purely for economic reasons, right, it makes sense to integrate the military, not have forced segregation. And so he will be the one to issue the deseg order for the military. And, you know, he had personal attitudes about it, and his personal attitudes were his own experiences during the war, which taught him, bad idea, doesn't make any sense, right? This Tuskegee Airmen I talked about last week, they had to train in totally separate facilities. They couldn't train with everybody else. Here's how far segregation extended. They were pilots, and they were training, and they were doing cross-country trains, right, training routes. And there were Army bases, because there was no Air Force at the time, there were Army bases that would not allow them to land. They would not allow, or refuel, because they were black.
How did they know the black men were calling them?
They knew who they were. Everybody knew who they were. They knew they were coming. They knew what the routes were. They knew they were coming. They were scheduled to land there. They would refuse. It's ridiculous. We're thinking about this in 2018. We're thinking, well, that's just stupid. Well, it was. But it was the way that they had operated. And Truman understood from personal experience that this was not wise. Right? This was not a good idea. A new political party will emerge for a brief period of time shortly after he issues that executive order. They're called the Dixiecrats. They were Democrats in the Deep South. They only were around for a couple of years, from 1948 to 1950. They absolutely resisted any civil rights legislation. And certainly they were resistant to desegregating the military. I would say